was chivalrous towards my mother and to all women that he knew. And as I used to say in the baptismal instructions with new parents, my dad never once took me to church, sent me to church. He took me with him. And kneeling next to him, growing up, I said to myself, I want to be like him. My dad died when he was 54. And he left my mother with 13 children, the youngest of whom were 5 and 6 years old. So I know what it is a bit to be in a troubled family, a family that has to struggle against odds. And so I hope that the ministry of the church in central and southern Indiana will have a special place in its heart for families. And not simply the nice and easygoing families, but the families who struggle. Families like my family, with a single mother who, with the help of her husband in heaven, had to raise 13 of us. And when people say, Mrs. Tobin, how wonderful, 13 children and they all went to college, her response is, how wonderful, 13 children, and they all practiced their faith. My family had the experience of being immigrants. My grandparents came from Ireland, and my own family, because we were beginning to fall out of the windows in southwest Detroit, looked for a place where we could build a home, and we had 40 acres over in Canada. So my family immigrated to Canada when I was 19 years old. And I have had the honor of serving immigrant communities. And I think there might be some here. And so I'd like to say, es un gusto llegar aquí y servir a ustedes como el pastor de esta iglesia. Y espero que ustedes cuenten siempre con el servicio y la buena voluntad del arzobispo y su hermano, José. The third thing I think that you should know about me is that I'm a product of a parochial school. I was grateful that the sisters put up with me, and I suspect they were happy to sign my application to the seminary. But it gave me great joy to come to this archdiocese and to discover already that it has one of the finest Catholic school systems in the United States, with 11 Catholic high schools and 58 elementary schools, educating almost 25,000 students. I'm happy to serve in the state of Indiana, which has such an enlightened policy in allowing parents to choose the best way they think they have for educating their children. And even in Rome, news of the voucher system reached us. And I'm grateful to the state, the people of this state, for having such an enlightened consciousness and supporting parents in their duties as educators. I think you should know that I'm a Redemptorist missionary, as Bishop Coyne told you. I belonged to a congregation that was founded in 1732, just kids compared to the Benedictines, outside Naples by St. Alphonsus Liguori, who was a lawyer and then later a priest. And his experience of leaving the city, where there were 10,000 priests in his lifetime, and going out to the countryside where there were very few, led Redemptorists in 78 countries of the world today to try and look for places where the church cannot or will not go. And I hope I have a missionary's heart, and I hope I have the wisdom of St. Alphonsus, who instructed his sons, saying, a missionary who arrives at the place of mission with all of his sermons prepared is like a doctor who shows up at a sick person's bed with all the prescriptions ready without ever meeting the person. I'm coming with a missionary's heart to learn, where is God opening a door for the Catholic Church in central and southern Indiana? I'm grateful that there are a number of religious communities in this archdiocese to enrich the archdiocese with their spiritual gifts and to help the church move forward. I don't think it's any coincidence that I've been asked to serve an archdiocese where the co-patrons are both religious. Francis Xavier, a Jesuit missionary, and Mother Theodore Guerin, the founder of the Sisters of St. Mary of the Woods. And I count on the communion of saints that they're going to help their brother. And finally, I think you should know that I'm 60 years old. And I think that's worth knowing, because it means that I've been around the block once or twice, that I've lived long enough to have some wonderful experiences and to know that my experiences aren't normative, that the experience of others are important and instructive. I've had to admit that I've been wrong. I've had the experience of asking for forgiveness. I've had the wonderful, invigorating experience of beginning again. And finally, at 60 years old, I appreciate more the wisdom of my novice master, who told us that an essential quality of the spiritual life is a sense of humor. He would say, boys, if you take yourselves too seriously, you're going to despair. I don't think that means that we live in a superficial or giddy manner, but that we have the sense of humor of St. Paul when he was writing about himself in 2 Corinthians and said, isn't it amazing that God chooses the ones who are weak? So it'll be clear that it's God's power that gets the job done. And for this, I'm grateful, too, to be of Irish descendancy. Because a great Irish comedian who died earlier this year, Hal Roach, said a gift that God gave to the Irish was the ability to laugh at themselves. God knows we give ourselves a lot of occasion for that. But it means we don't take ourselves so seriously, and we allow God to be the center of our lives. I'm going to do something very dangerous here. I'm going to, at the final moment of these remarks, I'm going to say thank you. And as a young pastor, they told me, be careful, because if you start naming names, you're going to forget people. So I'm going to name just a couple. I'm going to name especially Archbishop Daniel. I'm going to thank you for what you've done for this church for 19 years. I'm going to thank you for your example as a bishop, first in Memphis, now in Indianapolis, and now in retirement. And like Pope John Paul II, you show us the dignity and the acceptance of the cross, and that suffering doesn't have the final word. I thank Bishop Christopher Coyne, who was ordained and then stepped right into a baptism by fire. Thank you, Bishop, and thank you for making this transition so wonderful and life-giving for your brother bishop. I'm going to thank the staff of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, because although I've only been able to glimpse, I have a pretty good intuition that this is a competent, generous, and most importantly, faith-filled group. I'm going to thank the Presbyterate for carrying on without an archbishop. Maybe that's not a good sign if you could get on for more than a year without an archbishop. But since that's the way things go, we're going to get on together. I'm going to thank the people for this warm welcome. It's very humbling to come in and receive your welcome on the first day of service. I rarely say in conclusion, because someone once defined second wind as what happens when a Redemptress says in conclusion. But I want to call to mind the person whose feast we celebrate today, and that's the evangelist Luke. Luke, you know, in his gospel has some very interesting points of emphasis that distinguish him from the other three. In a certain sense, it's the longest gospel because it's told in 2 acts. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Luke has been called the evangelist of the poor, the evangelist of sinners, the evangelist of women. He was called by Dante the scribe of the gentleness of God. He also presents us in a very intimate way with God's mother. And I ask Mary, who sings about the great things that God did for her, to remember this church in which God has already done so many good things, and to remember this pastor who wants to be an instrument of God in central and southern Indiana. And the final point today comes from a moment of transition that we read about in the Old Testament. It's recounted in the second book of Kings, and I believe the second chapter, where the prophet Elisha receives a gift from his predecessor, Elijah. And it's a very interesting gift, if you recall. As Elijah is stepping into a fiery chariot and being carried off into heaven, something falls out of that chariot. It's a mantle. It's a cloak. It's something that, the symbol of prophecy. And I met with my predecessor this morning, and something was handed to me. And I look at it as a prophecy. I look at it as a mantle. I look at it as a link with Archbishop Daniel and the people of this wonderful archdiocese, and I accept it gratefully.
Thank you, Archbishop Tobin. We'll have time for some questions now from the media for the Archbishop, and then afterwards we'll have some limited time for some one-on-one interviews. So anybody who wants to start, go ahead.
Okay, the question was whether I had the good sense to seek a transfer to the Archdiocese of Indianapolis or anywhere. And the answer is no. I was not seeking any transfer. And I have to say that it wasn't simply in this occasion. I've never sought to be transferred anywhere in my life. But I've always been asked to go places, and it wasn't always easy to go. And it's not easy for me to leave my colleagues in the dicastery, which has the longest name, as Bishop Chris said, in the Roman Curia. But I can tell you there are 40 wonderful men and women who work together, accompanying about 1,300,000 members of the consecrated life across the world. And under the leadership of our prefect, who's a Brazilian, the Archbishop Emeritus of Brasilia, João Braz de Avis. And so I was, I was surprised. And, but I accept it, as God's plan, and I know that God will give me what I need to do this job. Thank you, Charlie.
What do you think the state of the Catholic Church is like in central Indiana, and what work do you think needs to be done?
Well, I would be really arrogant to give you a chapter and verse on that, because my impression, and I believe it's going to be carried out, is that I've been left a wonderful gift here by Archbishop Daniel. And the indicators that I've seen in the health of the parishes, the vocations to the priesthood. I began today celebrating the Eucharist at